This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of guys with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 287, Json API. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about a topic I don't know a ton about. Luckily, we have my other co-hosts with me today to discuss the Json API. I'm John Picozzi, and joining me this week, per usual, is Shane Thomas. Shane, what's going on with you?
Not too much, John. Got a little bit of a head cold, so that might be coming through here a little bit. But one thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit is this app called Around. If you're familiar with Zoom, which who isn't these days, you know that Zoom fatigue is real. A lot of times you get stuck in Zoom meetings hour after hour. This is kind of like having a different conference room. If you're used to going into an office, you have Zoom as your professional conference room, and this is kind of like that corner conference room that no one really goes into. So it's kind of a cool new way to have video chats and video conferences. It's just a little bit of a different spin on video conferencing. So it's not anything,
Is it like a water cooler kind of idea that you kind of just hang in there?
Yeah, it's less focused on the video and more focused on just like floating little blurbs on your screen, so it doesn't really take up too much of their screen real estate.
Okay.
So you find yourself staring at other people, your video and other people's video a little less, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little less distracting. It's just I think it's just doing something different than always being in the same, Zoom software all day long.
Interesting.
So it's kind of a nice little spin.
Cool. And that other voice you hear is Stephen Cross. Stephen, what is going on with you?
Hey everybody, I had a cool Raspberry Pi experience this weekend. I
love Raspberry Pi.
And when you make something that could actually use day to day, it's totally awesome. So
Raspberry Pi.
Yeah, that's what I did. So I saw a video or a blog post or something about someone who had written something where they could make a Raspberry Pi act as a mouse, and they could shake the mouse on the screen. The idea is, if you're in a corporate environment, and especially if you're working from home these days, you may have a corporate PC connected to a VPN, and the stupid thing logs you out every 10 minutes if you're not like currently on it. So this little app, and I'll show it to people in the video screen here. I took a Raspberry Pi Pico, which is a microcontroller, and I put a little button in a light there. And basically what it does is hooked to my PC. And when I push the button, it acts as a mouse. It's plugged into the PC, and it just makes the mouse move every 10 seconds back and forth, or every second back and forth. So the PC never falls asleep. And when I want to use it again, I just click the button again, and it turns the mouse shake off.
It's funny. I have so many thoughts about that. One is I'm assuming you're not bringing that device with you to work if and when you go back to work, seeing as it looks
if I was in
questionable.
Well, yeah, it looks like a bomb. I get it. But if I was in an office environment, I would need this security, right? Because I would want my computer to lock if I wasn't using it. When I'm at home, I don't really need that, but there's no way for me to shut that off.
It also makes me wonder. I've encountered folks who there's some sort of timing program on their computer for work to make sure that they're at their computer and doing stuff. Yeah. I imagine you would sell 1 million of those if you put them into mass production.
You can actually buy it. I found you could buy this device similar to this on Amazon for $20. It doesn't do what mine does. I can set a limit. So mine will turn off after 4 hours, so it doesn't stay on all night. So I set all this stuff in this. It's just, it was a fun project to do. I don't think I'll ever sell them. But if you guys need one, I'd be happy to make one for you and ship it to you.
I was thinking, what would I possibly have a need for? But then I did realize sometimes if my laptop's not plugged in, it'll go to sleep. And if I'm pulling something up and playing guitar maybe, and I'm just reading something, I could go 10 plus minutes without actually moving the mouse. So maybe I could use one.
Yeah, it's like just push the little button. It's awesome.
Steve, final question on that.
Yeah.
Any inclination to make a YouTube video to kind of tutorial on how somebody can make that?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to do that. I've already started a blog post for it. put the code up on GitHub yesterday. I got to clean it up and do a little stuff with it. So maybe in the next few weeks I'll put it out. And I actually am going to try to solder my first thing together too. I'm going to move off of a breadboard and solder this thing together with the parts and make a little case for it. So it's actually a piece of hardware that would sit on my desk.
So that way he could take it to work in if and when he returns to an office.
And have it look legit. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Like, hey, it's just a box with a port on it. That's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
Nick, last but not least, what is going on with you? You have to unmute the microphone and then speak.
I am a complete novice today. You reinstall your computer and forget all the rules of podcasting. I did a little spring cleaning this week with on the technical side, I guess. My hard drive crashed last week, so I had to reinstall. And I kind of took that into the weekend with my personal server. I went through 90% of all the Docker containers I have running and converted them to using versions, so I can be better about making sure things are in the latest version rather than just using latest. And I migrated my Home Assistant from using the built-in Z-Wave controller to using Z-Wave JS, which is a node-based Z-Wave controller. It is, not fully baked yet, but it's moving very fast, and it is blazingly fast compared to the old Open Z-Wave.
And when you say fast, do you mean response time? Like from using a device?
Yeah, I mean, even the built-in Z-Wave was never super slow for me unless I tried doing. So I noticed, for example, turning on a light or turning off a light is about twice as fast, but it's not a huge change, honestly, because it already was fast enough that you hit the button and the light's on. Now
but there's still enough of a delay that doesn't feel like real electricity, right?
Yeah. Now it's like before your finger leaves the button in the app, like the light's on. Okay. And the other thing is, if you do multiple actions, so I did find if I turn on and off a bunch of lights over and over for 4 or 5 seconds, it would start to delay. It would, and now, like, I haven't hit a delay like that, period. It also has more features. I mean, Open Z-Wave, it was built on 1.4, which is very old. So there were a lot of newer devices that just didn't quite have the capabilities built in, right? And, Z-Wave JS it was started in January, I think.
So two questions there. One, your technical spring cleaning, did you use soap and water for that or something else?
I used soap and JSON.
There you go.
Soap and YAML. YAML.
I see what you did there. Nice. Seriously though, had a hard drive crash. Did you replace the hard drive or did you just flash it and start over?
No, I just reinstalled. So I don't think it was a hardware issue. Actually, looking back, I think I figured out what it was. It was a combination of a couple things. One, I filled my hard drive too much one too many times. Like I kept running into space limits, and there were a couple of times I got down to, 20 megabytes of space, and that's not good. And then I recently converted from using CrashPlan, which is a backup solution, to using Synology, which is a different backup solution. And for a couple of weeks, I ran both. And I have a feeling running 2 backup solutions at the same time, I just have a feeling it didn't do nice things to my install. And then when I updated from 18 to 20, I think it just finally didn't, it just wasn't happy.
So let that be a lesson to you. Don't overstuff your hard drives, folks. As for me, I have I've expanded my podcast horizons. So a couple of weeks ago, my wife said, "Hey, I'm listening to this podcast." And I said, "Oh, interesting." And I didn't really think much of it. And then I was watching the Today Show or something, and they were talking about it. And I was like, oh, I think that's the one Laura brought up. Let me check it out. podcast is called Smartless. Don't know if anybody here is a listener, but essentially the premise is it's Jason Bateman, Sean Hayes, and Will Arnett. And every week, or every show, I should say, they bring on a guest, but one of them picks the guest and the other two have no idea who the guest is. They bring on the guest and then they just have a regular conversation. I will say they on some episodes tend to have a little bit of a potty mouth, but it is super amusing, and it's different from
they're all A-list, B-list kind of guests here.
Yes. Yeah. They're very, you would say high profile, I guess, folks, Kamala Harris, Clayton Kershaw,
Paul McCartney. Gee, that one's jumping out at me.
I haven't gotten that far yet. I'm only on episode 11, so I'm working my way up to present time, but, yeah, it's worth a listen. They're pretty quick. They're about 30 minutes, I think, give or take. And, there's some interesting stuff. The one with, the astrology guy there, Neil deGrasse Tyson, was super, super interesting. So check it out.
I just have to say it's astronomy, not astrology. I think you would appreciate that. Astrology is the Capricorn.
You're
astronomy is.
You're probably right. You're probably right. He would appreciate that, and I appreciate you correcting me in the fact that I'm an idiot. So, moving right along, I wanted to give a brief recap from episode 283. We were talking about Tugboat with our friend Matt Westgate, and I think I saw this tweet yesterday. Maybe it was. March 22nd, which was yesterday. That Tugboat is now on your contributed module pages and themes on Drupal.org. So you actually have like a live preview on Drupal.org of your work, which is pretty cool. I think it's a great progression of Drupal and the support that Drupal.org is providing to the development community.
Yep. Very cool.
So let's jump into our primary topic. Again, admittedly, I have used the JSON API and APIs in general. So I mean, I know what they are, but I think you guys are probably using them in more detail. So I'm interested to hear what you have to say. Let's just open it up really basic. What is an API?
I mean, I think every time we have a show about an API, we say this. It stands for Application Programming Interface. But I mean, the root of it is it's just a way for computers to talk to each other or talk to something, essentially. It's a standardized rule set for saying, hey, if you want to take this action or find this out or do this, here's how you communicate with me. Here's how you authenticate with me. And here's the response that I'll give you.
So fair to say it's basically taking two usually disparate systems, right? And basically giving them a language where they can talk to one another in some structured format, right? Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I'd say it's pretty accurate. I mean, it's a rule set or language. Like here's how you communicate.
So why would someone use an API? What do you think? Like, can we, spout off a few use cases or, a few examples of APIs that, some of us have used in the past?
One simple example is you might have a website and it has a bunch of data, and maybe you also want to have a mobile app that uses that same data. So by having an API, you can have a centralized place where your data is stored and you can use it in multiple different places.
Yeah, I know a lot of the work that we do at Oomph, we are often sharing information to and from Drupal to different third-party services, and that is all done via API. One API that actually just comes to mind, kind of hits me right over the head, is Stripe. Right? I think we've all probably used Stripe at one point or another. They have an awesome API for integrating payments into a variety of applications and websites.
I think an important thing with when you're thinking about APIs and why you use them is not just it's if you want to share data, but it's also if you want to extend functionality in your application but not write it yourself. So a nice example of that would be if you've got a website or an app and you want to do geolocation stuff. There's API services that you can subscribe to that when you pass it an address of some sort, it would give you back a latitude and longitude. That's not functionality that you would want to write yourself or could maintain yourself, but it's an API that you could subscribe to and say, here's an address, give me back a latitude and longitude.
And that's actually interesting, Steve, and brings up a point that I want to make really, really quick is that there are open APIs and like closed or protected APIs, right? So you have the ability to say like, for example, open API, hey, I'm just going to go query for this data. It's going to give me back a response. Steven actually, I think, uses an example of a Marvel API at some point, which is an open API, right? Right, Steven?
Yeah, that would be considered an open API. And when we say it's open, doesn't mean you don't need to be authenticated to use it. So
correct.
So an open API, generally, it's a publicly available API, but usually, probably most of the time now, I'm not even aware of an exception that you would need credentials like an API key, maybe a username password in order to get access to the API so you don't abuse it and they can track the usage of you using the API. As opposed to like something that's a private API, which means you probably have a business relationship and it's private information that you're passing back and forth.
Right. Or I mean that your subscription model is kind of like a private API, right? Because you're paying for a subscription and then gaining access, right?
Yes.
Yep. I think the other main place that I see APIs used, kind of similar to Shane's mention, is larger companies will sometimes have an API to have like a central location where they standardize communication between teams. So they might have, customer data set, and they have one team that manages, their customer management team. They have another team that manages their analytics, and they have another team that creates dashboards for KPIs or something, and we just maintain the API, and all those teams just they'll make feature requests. They kind of treat it as you almost treat them as external clients. Like you're just providing the API so that everybody can interact with each other on the same page, rather than just going to the source and nothing's maintained or nothing. Everybody's interacting differently, so updates become difficult because, it's going to break everything. The API just means, hey, we know, everybody knows what they're expecting. You can, create new versions if you need to modify things, but, everything's standardized.
So talk a little bit about some API protocols, and we promise we're getting to REST in a few minutes here. But when you think about APIs, there's standard protocols of the language that's spoken back and forth between the two sides of the conversation. So you may have heard about SOAP. It's probably the first API that I ever used years and years ago. One of the originals probably, and it stands for its abbreviation is for Simple Object Access Protocol. And this is like an enterprise level API or protocol. And it's used in highly secured, complex transactions. Its characteristics are it's very heavy and slow and complex, and it uses XML as the document format to pass back and forth. So you'll see SOAP used a lot in intercommunication between enterprise systems.
Yeah,
Another one. Go ahead.
I have to say I've never used SOAP and come away thinking like, yeah, that was a pleasant experience.
Same.
Exactly.
It's never been enjoyable.
Right. Another one is RPC. And I think I don't have what that means, but I think it means remote procedure call. Is that what it is? Maybe someone can Google that quick. So this is also like an enterprise level service. It requires high security. And again, it's used for high complex transactions like the SOAP. I I think these notes are actually incorrect because I believe it's very fast and it's not as slow. And RPC is used more for running functions on remote servers. So it'd be a way of not necessarily passing data back and forth, but actually requesting a function or a process to be run. And the last one I want to mention, and the one we're going to kind of drill in on today, is a REST format. And we're talking about the JSON API, which is REST. And basically, that is really the primary web service that's used today in the internet. It's in most web applications and mobile applications. It's lightweight, it's fast, it's easy to use, it's easy to understand, it's not complex. And the format that a REST passes back and forth are different document types, could be HTML, XML, and JSON. So JSON is going to be something we're going to drill into more today.
Just out of curiosity,
Yep.
question from the dumb guy on the group here. It only ever works in one of those formats, right? It doesn't mix formats. So you couldn't have an API that's giving you one reply or request in HTML and another one in XML, and then it's typically usually one of those formats, right?
Typically, I'm sure there's some that, I mean, and many times I've written APIs and worked with APIs where you can specify what you want back as well. That's fairly common. So you can say I want JSON or I want XML. It's not like defined or CSV or,
Got it.
on
Got
that
it.
point.
Right.
Just for completeness, RPC does stand for Remote Procedure Call, and REST stands for Representational State Transfer.
That'd be a great trivia question, right? What does REST stand for? Everyone knows it and uses it.
This acronym, the first two letters are only fall for one word. That's
so let's talk a little bit about REST API characteristics. So it's stateless. So the server doesn't need to retain information. And so communication between, the client and the server can be independent. And it kind of follows that client server architecture where, client can request something from the server, the API, responds and gives it something in return, right? Its ability to be cached, so the client can store data for a set period of time, and you may only need to request, updates after that cache expires or something like that. And then it's over HTTP, so it's similar to using a web browser, right? You're just making a request over HTTP, you're getting a response back, and then doing whatever you need to with that response.
And the caching thing, I think, is actually pretty interesting too, because because it's URI based for simple APIs, you can use something like Varnish for that. But there's also a lot of services that you can use that will handle API caching and give you ability to dump caches, that they specialize just in doing that as well.
Yeah, and it as was kind of mentioned before, it supports the use of HTML, XML, plain text, JSON, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So JSON, JavaScript object notation, right? Everyone, that's a trivia question I think everyone would maybe have been able to get. That's a little easier than REST. And it's just a text format. Everyone's probably seen it and maybe not even known that they've seen it. It's really just a format for storing and transporting data, typically across HTTP. And so it's used, a lot of times when you're requesting things from servers or when data is getting sent back and forth from a web page to, or from a server to your web browser. And it's meant to be kind of self-describing or readable. So you could kind of look at a JSON document and you could understand what the data is that it represents. So you could read it, even though it's not, there's still some notation and some formatting to it. It's overall pretty readable that you can kind of understand what the data is actually representative of. So then we can go ahead.
I want to mention something nice about JSON is that when it's self-describing, It allows the JSON format to breathe a little bit. So, and without your system to break. So let's say you get a JSON document or an API that you're dealing with, and you're taking 5 fields from it, and the document describes that if a sixth field comes in, it gets added there. You could see that in the JSON document, and it generally will not break, depending on how you write your code though, but it will generally not break the document or your code because a 5th or 6th element was added and you didn't expect it, which is not the same as some of the previous or the other layouts that we had earlier.
So let's talk a little bit about JSON API. And that's what the topic of the show. It's really a specification for APIs using JSON as the format. So JSONAPI.org is really kind of the guiding resource for what JSON API actually is. It was drafted, and I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this name correctly, but Yehuda Katz in 2013, and it was stable in 2015. So it really provides a CRUD, which is a create, read, update, delete mechanism. So you can create data through JSON API, you can read it, which is of course consuming that data. You can provide updates, or you can actually delete these objects through this JSON API specification. It's really kind of like a contract for how APIs or how the API should be designed and should be written. And it has support for things like filtering, pagination, sorting, revisions, translations as well. So you can really build a robust API using this specification.
So, I mean, just to be clear, JSON API is a Drupal module, but the JSON is not related to Drupal in any way. It's just a specification that the Drupal module is using when interacting with Drupal data, correct?
Yeah, correct. So the Drupal module basically adheres to this specification that's defined, as like an external third party.
So again, to clarify for the basic person, me, basically, JSON is the language. JSON API is the structure that language is in order for, again, 2 machines or 2 systems to kind of talk to one another.
Be careful with the word language.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's the schema.
Yeah.
Trying to put it into layman's terms, guys.
Yeah.
The communication tool.
The structure of the file or schema, it would be the JSON. So it's like the difference between a CSV file and a .text file. When you have a CSV file, you expect a certain structure.
You expect those commas.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Got it. Interesting.
And then maybe one more thing we'll talk about just briefly is GraphQL. So that's something you may have all heard about. Was created, I think, by Facebook. It's really a query language for your API. So there are some specific specifications for what a GraphQL API looks like, but it works really well for querying because you can be very specific about the data that you're going to request and get back, so that you're not getting, with some of the other APIs, you get a whole bunch of data that you don't always need all of it. In this case, you can be much more specific about the exact fields of data you want, and you can get many resources in a single request. So you can span relationships where, with REST and JSON API, that's a little bit more difficult to do, getting, for instance, related entities or related resources. So that's something that we can talk a little bit more about in the future, but it's really kind of a newer way to consume data from an API. And in the same way that, SQL is kind of a query language for a database, GraphQL is kind of a query language for interacting with an API. So
is it a language, or is it a specification like the JSON API is? Or is it both?
It's
or does GraphQL use JSON API as the
there are specifications for how you design and build your GraphQL APIs.
Yep.
And it wouldn't use necessarily JSON API or anything else under the hood. It would use its own schema. So there's like schema definition language. You define your GraphQL schema, and then you'd use GraphQL queries, which are kind of structured data that you send, and then the server reads that structured data, which is kind of in the form of a JSON-like object, and then it responds back with the data that you requested.
Okay. It does, I haven't used GraphQL, but what I've read about it, it seems to provide have some of the same goals that JSON API has in terms of accessing content in an API format.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of similarities, and there's a lot of cases where you could use one or the other, and they're relatively interchangeable. You're just going to change how you interact with that API.
Interesting. So now that our listeners know all the acronyms and all the different schemas, we can finally turn back to the Drupal portion of this. So, so both of these, API schemas, what have you, they're all like specs outside of Drupal. They're off the island specs, if you were. Drupal does have a couple of ways to interact with them. So there's a couple of core modules. One of them is RESTful, which helps you provide a RESTful API to interact with your Drupal data. And there's also Json API, which provides a JSON API compliant endpoints to interact with the data as well. And then there's also GraphQL. That's a contributed module, but it's got a fair amount of support in the community as well. So I think the first thing to consider is how do you decide which one to use when you're looking at the different options. The RESTful module, I think that's a little bit older. I think there was a Drupal 7 version and maybe even earlier. That's a good one to choose if you're trying to interact with non-entity data. If you're trying to do some special functions, I think RESTful is a good module for creating those. I think it also works well with views, creating views endpoints.
I would say that you would use the RESTful module if you know you need it.
Yeah.
if you're like, if you're approaching that, hey, I have a website and I want to provide an API to my users, you should be going after the JSON API. You should be looking at that. It's only when that doesn't work for you, for whatever case you have, then look to the RESTful module.
Yeah, so the JSON API module kind of out of the box gives you access to entities. So if you want to get a list of users, get a list of a content type, add a node, add a user, delete a user, those kinds of things just kind of come out of the box. And a lot of things are expecting the JSON API structure on the reading end. So, JSON API kind of gets you really far just out of the box, just turning that module on. And then the GraphQL module, like Steven, I've not used GraphQL other than just like minor experiments. So maybe Shane, you can talk a little bit about how that module works and what it gives you out of the box.
So I believe the version 3 GraphQL module is pretty handy in that you turn it on and it gives you the API. It kind of it creates the schema for you, similar to how JSON API works. Now, version 4, the newest version, I believe it's version 4, is a little different in that it expects you to define your own schema, which is really good in a lot of ways because you can be very specific about the data you want to expose. You're not exposing anything unintentionally. However, it's also kind of a setup headache because you have to be intentional about it. You can't just turn it on and you just get all the data, which is one of the great things about JSON API, but just also one of the things to be aware of, that anything that is public content is available through JSON API once you turn it on. Now, it doesn't provide you access to private content that you have to be logged in to see unless you're authenticated. But it is important to know that any content that is considered public is immediately available as soon as you turn it on, which is,
And by the way, public doesn't mean that you put it on a page. Public means that you added a field to a node and didn't wrap any security around it. So if there's a field that you put on a node, they can get through it by the default settings of the JSON API, even if you haven't put it on a view. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
It's pretty much open access to your entity, whatever that entity type is, if it's not secured. One question about GraphQL, which I appreciate you pronouncing it correctly, being that you work for Gatsby, Shane. I'm sure you know the proper wording of that. I've heard it pronounced graphical before, but anyway.
So actually, GraphIQL is actually a query tool for querying a GraphQL server. So you probably hear a lot of times it's maybe interchangeable, whereas people will use it, but they're not technically the same thing. So GraphQL is kind of the query specification. Then Graphql is a tool for actually reading data and being able to pull data in from that GraphQL server. So
that's going to be my actual question here is Graphql the in-browser tool that you would use with GraphQL to kind of build your queries?
Yeah, you nailed it exactly. So yeah, Graphql is that tool where you can it connects to your GraphQL API, you run the queries, and then typically you'll use those queries in whether it's your mobile app or whether it's your Gatsby site or whatever. You'll use that to actually, develop your queries, and then you'll use those queries in your application.
Fabulous. Thanks for clearing that up.
And there's been a lot of talk in Drupal over the past number of years about being an API first strategy. And it's around this API, this REST API module that this is about, is that when you install Drupal and turn it on, you have an API and it works. So that's really what it's all about. And it's like zero configuration. You just enable the REST API module and you have access to everything. And it provides, create, read, update, and delete features. It does. We mentioned a minute ago, Shane mentioned that you have access to everything, all the fields that are generally public. There is a module called a REST API Extras that you can install that helps you lock down things. So if there's some entities that you don't want exposed, or there's fields that you don't want to show up in the REST API, that module provides extra functionality to lock things down and make some of those configuration changes. So
JSON API Extras, but yeah, exactly. You're
what
exactly
did I call
right.
it?
REST API.
Sorry.
We're getting too many acronyms. We have too many acronyms going on today.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a very useful module for securing your JSON API for sure.
Yeah. So basically you just turn this thing on and it works. So one eye opener is when you start to play with this is you turn that module on and then you just go to the URL and you like put in /JSON API /article and you get article content showing up in a JSON file. It's pretty wild.
It's interesting because as you were describing this, I was thinking of commerce, and I've worked with this module, these sets of modules, with a commerce site to expose cart endpoints and product endpoints and that sort of thing. So it's interesting to hear how they can be used, and that's a pretty good use case if you're looking to try kind of jump into this stuff.
Yes. Yeah. And speaking of URLs, I think one of the real strengths of the JSON API structure is that it gives you those standardized URLs. So it's basically, JSON API entity type bundle, if there is one, and then the UUID if you want to get just one field. So you could do like JSON API node article /3, and you'll get article 3, or you do JSON API paragraphs, and then some paragraph type, and then the entity number, and you'll get that paragraph's data. And then there's a couple of special ones I think that you can filter as well, but it's if once you've used it a couple of times, you're just used to what the URLs are, and you don't have to do a whole lot of hunting, to find out exactly how to structure it if you're looking for just simple queries. So yeah, it's pretty powerful. It's something you can just throw up and simply test me and create a node and hit the URL, and you'll get the JSON back for whatever entity you're looking for.
Yeah, one of the really cool things about it too is if you just go to that /JSON API endpoint, and this works well if you're using Firefox, or you have a JSON API extension in Chrome or whatever browser you're using, but it'll format it for you, and you can actually just click the links. It's pretty well documented, so there's links between these different endpoints, so you don't have to guess and find out how do I get to articles. It's actually pretty navigatable just by clicking through the results there. So it's a useful feature to you can explore. It's allows you to explore the API and find out what data is available and how you would access it.
It's interesting talking earlier about URIs and now talking about URLs. We can see, how easy it is to get the data out of the JSON API. But and this was actually as I was reading the show notes, this was new to me. I was not aware that there are some additional features that you can use as kind of query parameters, if you will, to your request to be able to do certain things. So I'm going to run through the list, and then we can kind of go back and talk about each one and maybe come up with a few use cases. So features like filtering, sorting, pagination, an include, and then create and update, which is interesting. So the filtering, I mean, it seems kind of pretty basic to me. I understand what filtering is, but can anybody give me a good use case as to when you might want to use something like this?
Yeah, I mean, I would say one option is, let's say you had, an article that you wanted to filter for specific tags. So you only wanted to get all the articles that were tagged with a certain taxonomy term. You could then run this filter by passing that in the URL, and it would only respond with those, tagged with whatever term you're looking for. So that's one example where I could see that. Then there's probably some more too.
I got it. So in the show notes, we'll have a little example here, but basically the filter is looking at whatever the key is for that JSON item, and then filtering on a specific ID. Is that the general idea?
Yeah. Yep. That's pretty much it. Yeah. You filter, you specify the filter field and then the value you want to filter for. And I believe it is flexible too, where it's not just, there's more documentation on Drupal.org, of course, but it's pretty flexible in how you can actually filter for that data.
And I'm assuming you can do multiple filters.
Yes. It can get very complex. Yep.
There you go. Perfect. It works exactly how I thought it would. That's amazing. Yep. So moving on, sort is, pretty straightforward. You basically use it in the same way that, similarly to how you use filter to set a sort order on things. Is that pretty accurate?
Yep.
All right. I'm knocking it out of the park.
Yeah. Self-explanatory. This is self-documenting, right? Here we go again. For experienced Drupal users, if you think of a view, I mean, things that you can do in a view in Drupal, you can pull that data through the JSON API.
Which leads us to our
go ahead.
Next one, which is pagination, right? And so somebody explained to me when I might need pagination when making a API request, or how that is useful.
Super simple. There's 100,000 articles.
Okay. I don't want them all. I don't want them all at once.
You don't want them all. So what JSON API does, which is kind of interesting, is you can tell it how many you want at the beginning or where you want to start. And you can say, I want 50, and I want 50 at a time. So it gives you the 50 rows or nodes. And then it gives you a link to get the next 50, and that link in the JSON structure is a call back to the API to get the next 50 with the syntax already in the URL.
Oh, so if you're building some sort of front end there, you have all the pieces you need to kind of build a pagination, Drupal terms view, right?
Yeah, it's well thought out. I mean, that's one of the reasons why it's become kind of the standard
so
to use.
So the next couple are seems to be more powerful features. Maybe there's an include. What would that be used for?
So include is really. Oh, go ahead, Nick.
No, you go ahead.
I would say include's really powerful because if in Drupal you relate entities all the time, right? You use entity reference fields to relate. Maybe it's taxonomy terms, or maybe you have an article and you want to say what are related articles to this. Within one call to JSON API, you could say, I want to follow that entity reference field and include any entities that are referenced by that entity reference field. So in the case of you want all the taxonomy term data for that article, or you want any of the articles that are referenced as potentially related articles. So any entity reference field where you want to get that entity data back because maybe you need it for the page you're building, or you want to use that data in some way, that's where include is really powerful because it follows those entity relationships.
Cuts down on server calls.
Yeah.
Other APIs, you have to make multiple calls to build those relationships.
So it's more performant.
Yeah,
well, it's heavier on the server side, like on the initial call, but overall it's definitely more performant.
But I just learned I can paginate it, so I should be okay.
So one of the questions I actually had thinking about this is, can you specify things like display modes, for example? Like, can you specify, hey, give me the related article, but give me the teaser, like whatever fields are available in the teaser view, for example? That's not something I've ever tried to do.
Yeah, I don't think you can. I think that's one of the few drawbacks is that it gives you all the data of the entity. It basically says, here's the entity, here's all that entity data. So even if you don't want some of those fields, you are going to get that data back.
So it can be less performant. But
yeah.
We're back to square one.
I don't think you can say, give me these 5 fields from this big list.
Okay. So a lot of that filtering still happens at the front end, whatever that is. Okay.
And that's one, when we talked about GraphQL, that's one of the arguments for GraphQL is that you can specify to the field level what you want. So, but there's of course trade-offs with anything, right? So JSON API is a lot better for creating and updating, which I think is another feature that we haven't really talked too much about. But it does require authentication. You have to authenticate. And I know GraphQL, sometimes you can do what GraphQL calls mutations, but typically it's a little bit more complicated and not quite as performant as when you're using through JSON API.
So, I mean, this conversation actually, before we get to our last feature here, makes me think that when you're planning out an API, right, or that your data could be used for an API, that it's super important to think about the amount of fields you're putting on an entity, or like if somebody were to request, a list of these entities and all of these fields had to come back, like trying to minimize kind of the use of fields or structure your data in a more logical sense, or as logical as it can be, right? That sounds like it'd be important, right?
Well, I think yeah, your point is a really good one, John, in that if API access isn't important for what you're building, thinking about that when you're doing your content architecture at the beginning is probably helpful if you're going to be using, deciding what API structure you're going to use. You're going to use REST API or GraphQL, and how you structure that. You do have the module that we mentioned earlier that you can, just because you have 35 fields on a content type doesn't mean you need to share those 35 fields either.
Mm-hmm. Right. So speaking of our last feature here, create and update. This sounds again kind of important. It's a more powerful feature of the JSON API. Can somebody tell me what that does?
So Shane, you had mentioned, that, it'll create an update allows you to kind of, it's exactly what it sounds like. You can create entities or update existing entities and change them. And you mentioned that GraphQL has a little bit of trouble with that. Do you ever see people using both of these, like using JSON API for the, the create and update part and GraphQL for the read part?
I mean, I don't want to say that you can't do it in GraphQL. You of course can, but it just seems a little bit more straightforward with JSON API. It's a little easier, more approachable, I think. I don't know that I've ever seen anyone use both, but I'm sure it's possible. I think you kind of commit to one, and there's so much overlap between what you do. It's really, a lot of it, I think, is preferential, and just how, there are certain limitations and trade-offs, and there are some things that work better. JSON API works really well with Drupal because almost everything in Drupal is an entity, and JSON does a really good job of just exposing that data as entities in a JSON format. But yeah, I don't know if you'd ever use both at the same time. I'm sure there are use cases that I'm not thinking of, but I think typically people choose one and stick with that.
So last question, this section here. Documentation, API documentation, super important, right? It's important if you're building an API, or you need to use an API. Real good documentation is super important. I'm assuming everybody would agree with that.
I prefer the least documented SOAP API possible. I mean, it just makes it more fun. You just have to hit like, you don't even know the URLs. You're just gonna have to hit them.
You can send your complaints to Nix Van NIVX.
No, so yeah, I mean, documentation, like you said, John, I mean, it's critical. And I've seen a bunch of different ways it's done. There's services out there that help with that. Like Apiary, I think, is probably one of the more popular ones. And the thing that I really like about for Apiary, for example, is you can do things like, it doesn't just say like, hey, here's the URL. It says, here's the URL, here's the arguments it's expecting, here's the responses you'll get. Here's like a sample snippet interacting with it in PHP or JavaScript or, C# or, whatever. So you can, if you're a user trying to integrate with that API, it just gives you the tools that you need to know, like, here's how you can get a successful call working.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I bring it up is because I've used some APIs with really dreadful documentation where, things have not been documented. And I think we probably all have. And it's important. That's all I'm saying.
The truth comes out. John was playing like he never used an API in his life. And now he's saying, when I use APIs, I like good documentation. What's up, John?
Well, because I'm an idiot and I want to be able to understand how to best use this thing in the most effective way.
And there's a couple of tools that you can use to help you with your JSON API work. One, has anyone used this? The JSON API Explorer. It's a tool from Acquia. It's a module and like an online tool where it's like a query builder thing. So you can get access to an API and then use this kind of like a MySQL admin kind of interface where you pick the fields you want to filter on and sort by, and it will generate the URL you need to access the JSON API. It's a really interesting tool to use. It's a great way to learn the syntax and learn how JSON API works. You also have the most basic way to test an API is a curl command from the command line, which is basically an HTTP client. Most computers have it installed. If not, it's pretty easy to install and run the man page. You can basically do a curl, and it's the same as kind of putting the URL in a browser, but you do a curl from a command line and you can get the JSON file back.
Yeah, that's also really helpful when you're just starting out, trying to make sure you're like hitting the right place. Sometimes, like, I mean, you can get more complex with it. Like Stephen said, you can actually use it, but curl sometimes it's easier sometimes to see the headers too. And And it's just like you said, it's a command line tool. You just open up a terminal, run it, and you can see it right there. You don't have to like set anything up or open a program or.
You can print it to the screen and look really cool if you're trying to impress somebody like you're a hacker. But Steven, it sounds like you can also print that to a file. Is that accurate?
I guess you could put pipe it to a file. Sure.
Got it. Okay, cool. Good. Well, I mean, I'm just saying back when we were talking about pagination, if I have 100,000 items, I don't want all those things printed to the screen.
Right. Something we don't have on the list here that I just want to mention before we get to my next one is in your browser, I think Firefox will format JSON by default, but other browsers you might need to either turn on dev mode or add a plugin.
Yeah,
so it's handy to have nicely formatted JSON when it comes back.
I don't think Firefox does it anymore. I think they took it out. I've actually had to.
Really?
I've actually had to pull up JSON in Chrome in order to get it to look good or readable.
Yeah, I use a Chrome extension called JSON Viewer in Chrome, and then it formats it pretty nicely. But I thought Firefox used to, so I'd be surprised that they don't. But maybe.
Yeah, no, Firefox still does. I don't know what
does it.
Version John is using.
Yeah. See, like I said, last time I tried to use JSON in Firefox, it didn't work so well. But maybe I was doing something wrong.
It could be malformed.
So Postman is another common tool.
I do use Postman. It's great.
It's come along. I mean, it's turned into like a whole environment now. It used to be a simple tool years ago. Now it's like this whole ecosystem, and you can get a free version of it. It runs, so it's a tool that runs on your computer. I think it runs on all the platforms. It's really good to use this if you're doing complex API work. Like if you have to do OAuth 2 with remembering tokens and token expiring and that kind of stuff, dealing with a API, Postman is a good way to go. I don't know if there's probably other tools like that, but it's a great way to go.
It's also really useful for doing things like, many times the REST API will have the same endpoint, will have a get, a post, a put, and a delete option, and it's very easy to change the method. You can store calls. So if you have, so for example, I have one client that has an API. They have a random API. There's only one endpoint, and you use that to get a token, and you need that token in order to do anything. And you only need that token like once every 7 months or so. So 6 months or so. So I have a post. Oh, I had a Postman. I'm realizing something else I lost, but I had a Postman project saved that I could just go in there, log in, create the new token, and then insert that token where it needed to go when it expired. So it's really useful for storing those kinds of things where I only have to hit the API once in a while. Doesn't make sense to have an interface for it. I just use Postman.
Okay, so I want to jump in here. I use Postman. Postman's great. I'm an idiot, so it wasn't a JSON feed. It was actually a XML formatted feed that Firefox wouldn't read. So retract my previous.
I would just say on Postman too, one great feature is I was building it was a Drupal site where I was handling the Drupal side, the API side, and I had someone not familiar with Drupal that was doing either React Native or Ionic or some kind of mobile front end. And so I went into Postman and made a bunch of the requests, and then I can save them. You can share that workspace with other people.
Else.
So then
that's really cool.
It was kind of like documentation for how to use the API. And obviously it was useful for me too, to actually make sure the API was working as expected.
Makes sense.
The other tool I just added that I think is sometimes useful, especially if you're working with JSON, is there's a website called jsonformatter.curiousconcept.com that will validate your JSON, and it'll find that errant comma or single quote or whatever issue you have with your JSON. I mean, obviously you got to be careful.
VS Code is pretty good at that too, right?
Yeah, but sometimes I've had situations where like, I mean, not to get too far in the weeds, but I've had situations where the JSON is actually in a JS file. So it's a valid object, but it's not a valid JSON, but it needs to be read as JSON.
Yep.
And VS Code won't find that because it's valid JavaScript, but not JSON. But you do have to be careful what you put in there. Obviously, it's public. I'm sure they, or maybe not public. I'm sure they store the information, so I wouldn't put anything sensitive in there. But it's really useful for just quickly seeing if you're generating an API, just really quickly seeing if something is valid or not. I can't believe that we've gotten this far in the show and we've only mentioned Shane has only mentioned Gatsby once when we're talking about APIs in Drupal. But one of the really big things that people have been using GraphQL, JSON API, and RESTful for is setting up headless Drupal sites. And I think the three main ways are Gatsby, React, and Vue.js probably right now. But it's just a very easy way to basically allow Drupal to be your content management system, and then use some sort of JavaScript front end on the front. But you need, the JavaScript front end needs the data to display, and JSON API is a way to give that data to the front end.
Yeah, I suppose I can talk a little bit about Gatsby, and of course, I'm an unbiased observer, right, of Gatsby. So take this for what it is. But yeah, the cool thing about Gatsby is you can use a plugin, Gatsby source Drupal. You install that plugin, you turn on JSON API on your Drupal site, and it pulls in all your data from Drupal, just sucks it in. And you can use it within Gatsby. And kind of one of the powerful things of Gatsby is you can pull data from multiple sources. So let's say you have a marketing team that just loves their WordPress blog, and you want to use Drupal for the landing pages, and because you're used to Drupal, you could pull blog content from WordPress and everything else from Drupal. Or let's say Shopify products from Shopify, but you want to store all the product information and page layouts and everything in Drupal. You could pull that from Drupal. So Gatsby can use Drupal's JSON API. It pulls it into a Redux data store, and then it puts a GraphQL API on top of that. So it pulls all the data in locally. So let's say Shopify, WordPress, Drupal, wherever your data is coming from, pulls it into running locally on your system if you're running it in develop mode. And then there's a GraphQL API, so you can use the same GraphQL queries to pull Drupal data, to pull data from WordPress, to pull data from Shopify, to pull data from local files, anything like that. So sorry, not to go too far off topic here. So if you're using GraphQL in Drupal and Gatsby, are you saying that Gatsby doesn't pull directly from GraphQL, it pulls into Redux and then puts a GraphQL layer on top of that? So you're going Redux, Drupal, GraphQL, Redux, GraphQL, Gatsby?
Redux is basically the data store for all of your sources.
Yeah, think of it like a database. Yeah, so essentially, let's say on Drupal, you turn on the JSON API module. You use Gatsby source Drupal. You just hook it up. When you run Gatsby develop or Gatsby build locally on your machine, it's going to pull all the data from Drupal to your local machine.
I follow that.
Into Redux. And then on Redux, which is basically your database, there's a GraphQL API. So you can query that data and then build your graph or your Gatsby pages from that. That adds a little complexity because you have that build step where it's pulling all that data in. You're not just like streaming it right to a page in Gatsby.
But it adds so much flexibility though, because you get the layer in between all those different technologies.
Yeah, right. You can hook up whatever you want.
Yeah, so it's the idea of this thing called the content mesh, where you pull content from multiple different sources, pull it into one API, and then on your page you might be displaying data with Shopify products and Drupal information, and maybe stuff from a WordPress blog or wherever else you might store data.
I mean, it has to do that though because it's static, right? So
we're gonna go down a rabbit hole for a second here. Just, and this could be a yes or no question, but Redux, does that like come bundled like with Gatsby when you install it, or is that like additional?
Yeah, you would never even know it exists.
Got it. Okay.
You would never even have to know it exists. I mean,
perfect.
Yeah, it's an under the hood kind of thing. So the same with, you don't need to worry about how the GraphQL API stuff is set up on your your Gatsby site, what's going on under the hood. You essentially just install a plugin. A plugin in Gatsby is kind of like a module in Drupal. You install the plugin, you point it to your Drupal site, turn on JSON API, and it just pulls in all the data.
Fabulous.
I have, before we close here, I have a funny Gatsby story. It's very brief. Yesterday, I was debugging some issues with secured cookies in Drupal. So I was trying to think to myself, let me go to a few Drupal people that I know have Drupal sites and let me look at what cookies, their session cookies they have. So I go to oomphinc.com expecting, right, I could see what their Drupal cookies were. Nope, there was a Gatsby cookie in there. Or a Gatsby identifier somehow. So I had forgotten you guys switched over to Gatsby at some point.
Yep. That website is very much not Gatsby, very much not Drupal.
Right.
It is Gatsby and
Yeah,
contentful.
Yeah. Right.
That was it. That was the end of the story.
That was the story. Yeah.
Oh, I thought you went to a couple more places and got met with Gatsby, and then you were like, okay, forget it. I'm just going to go build whatever I'm doing in Gatsby.
Lame story. So, hey, if you have any questions or feedback, you can reach out to us on Twitter at Talking Drupal. You can always go to the Drupal Slack as well and join our channel, Talking Drupal. You can also email us at show@talkingdrupal.com. And if that is not enough, you can also sign up for our newsletter, talkingdrupal.com/newsletter. That newsletter will give you show notes in your inbox and a little bit of different information here and there.
And I'd like to take a moment to thank our patrons for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose the Become a Patron button. And our patrons get to hear a little bit of the before show and the after show.
Well, this has been a very informative talk. I feel like I learned a lot, and I guess I knew a little bit more about APIs and the JSON API than I let on. But if somebody wanted to bend your ear about this sort of thing or Gatsby, Shane, where would they find you?
Twitter, smthomas3 is a great place to start. I'm on Drupal Slack too as Code Karate, so you can find me on Drupal Slack as well if you want to have a conversation.
You can also find him here for the next 2 episodes as well.
That is true. Nick, what about you?
You can find me online pretty much everywhere at Nick's Fan. And, I'd love to hear about your API horror stories. I think I always find them fascinating. See what people come up with sometimes.
I feel like that's going to be a new blog for you. Nick's API horror stories. Reminds me of a spot from Net Magazine. They used to do like client horror stories. I always found those super interesting. Steven, where can people find you? StevenCross.com. And how about you, John? I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. You can find out about Oomph at the Gatsby site, oomphinc.com. And as always, if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See ya.